responsible for Richard Lazarus' chair here at Harvard Law School. So I am overlooking very famous people who are also with us. But let me move on to the most famous. I could spend a half an hour introducing our illustrious panel. This is really a glorious, remarkable, outstanding group of people. With the exception of Jim, and there's still time.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Jody.
That's the beginning of a sentence. This is not the end of the letter. With the exception of Jim, and there's still time, I have worked personally with each of the other three members. And I can tell you that on a personal level, they are all just as outstanding, remarkable as they are professionally. But let me start with Jim, who is going to be our key historian, I hope. Jim was the first chief of staff to Bill Russell's house at the dawn of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. He was involved in building that agency from the ground up. He then returned to the agency as general counsel when Russell's house returned in the Reagan administration. He is now serving as a professor at Indiana University School of Law and is still deeply involved in environmental issues, nationally, internationally, speaks and writes extensively. See, they're important when they get calls.
That was just me, I'm so sorry.
Jim speaks and writes extensively, but we're going to mine his knowledge of the dawn of the agency, the early years of building it, and we're thrilled to have you so far. Bill Reilly served as the administrator of the EPA in the George H.W. Bush administration. He presided the EPA during many important events, among them the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which Bill had to deal with as administrator and dealt with very gracefully, I might add. And he led a delegation to Rio for the climate talks, for the climate treaty, and so was there at the beginning of international efforts to deal with climate change, and I hope he'll talk something about that. Bill has also been active in every domain in environmental law and natural resource protection, from his years in the nonprofit sector, heading up the World Wildlife Fund and Conservation Foundation, as well, major organizations, to his work on many boards, including Prudential, where I had the wonderful opportunity to join him at the end of his tenure. And he's still very much in the news. His most recent service for president was with President Obama, co-chairing the investigation, the commission that investigated Deepwater Horizon spills in the Gulf. And so we're thrilled, Bill, that he's here to join us. Gina McCarthy served most recently as administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency for President Barack Obama. She led the agency's efforts to take the most important steps the federal government has yet to take in tackling climate change, including by implementing the President's Climate Action Plan, the key pillars of which included the Clean Power Plan to regulate greenhouse gases from the power sector, but many, many other accomplishments in air pollution regulations, water pollution control, toxics, etc. And so we are thrilled to have Gina with us today. She has a long and storied career in public service prior to her service in the Obama administration, serving as 5 governors, 6, pardon me, both parties in Massachusetts, and serving herself as the head of the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection. So she is our pollution regulator from long ago, and also our local Boston girl. Yeah. Harvard, where she's professor of practice in the public health school, starting shortly. And Richard Lazarus, whom you all know, but I can't help but introduce him with great enthusiasm. He's not going to work for this one session. He's the main brains behind this entire bicentennial celebration. He deserves huge credit for organizing everything. One panel, he's actually a panelist because he is the leading expert in the country on environmental law, environmental protection, Supreme Court environmental law. He is, in fact, the Catherine and Howard Abel Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He has argued, he's represented over, I think, 40 clients in the Supreme Court and argued, I think it's 14 now, 14, most recently the Barr case, one in the Supreme Court just recently. He's my partner in all things in our environmental law program here at Harvard Law School. We agree on everything. It's actually true. He has written a book, I think which maybe you've read, called Making Environmental Law. So with him and Jim here, we have history of both ends of the table. So we are going to have a conversation with our guests. I'm going to pose them some questions which they have not seen in advance. And then I hope that you will all pose some questions and chime in, because I know we have a lot of expertise in the room at EPA and elsewhere in the government, and we have many alums with things that I think we would love to hear. And students, too, who will have many questions for our panel. So let me start, Jim, with you. First, I also have some great shots of them, which I'm going to occasionally flash up. Some when they were younger, some when they bounced. It's actually fun. Okay.
Some when I had hair.
Was that hard? I don't know if I succeeded there. But Jim, I want to ask you to get us started. You were there at the beginning, the dawn of what is now the Environmental Protection Agency that we know and love, but nobody knew and loved it at the time you were on the scene. So can you tell us something about the creation of the agency in the first years of Bill Russell's house?
Sure. Well, if we go back to those halcyon days of yesteryear, and maybe to set the stage a little bit, if you looked at the situation in the country in the late 1960s and 1970, 1968, environment didn't show up in the presidential campaign at all. No comments from either, really, or speeches from either candidate. By the time we get to 1970, the first Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970, you had a vast outpouring of public concern about the environment of estimated 20 million people doing things from protesting, sit-ins, cleanup campaigns, education campaigns, and so on. And what we were seeing happening, and the poster children for the problems are ones that are frequently averred to, but we had the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire, threatening a bridge. Lake Erie was was pictured as dying, choking to death on algae. There was a major oil spill in the Santa Barbara Channel that coated some of the beaches in California with oil. The national bird, the bald eagle, was headed toward extinction because of the use of DDT in this country was thinning the eggshells of the birds. And well, I mean, there's some other things that had happened in the not too distant past. An inversion in Donora, Pennsylvania, that had killed something like 40 people, put half of the people in the town in the hospital. So a variety of environmental insults, all very visible, things you could smell, taste, see. People finding that their favorite fishing hole was no longer producing fish that they'd want to think about eating, even if it would produce fish. So we get into 1969, Congress passes the National Environmental Act, which President Nixon signs January 1st, 1970, and proclaims that the 1970s are going to be the decade of the environment. And then at that point in time, Senator Edward Muskie of Maine, who's the head of the Air Subcommittee, is drafting an air pollution control bill, also suggesting that there ought to be an environmental agency created. Nixon had utilized the Ash Commission to look at how the environmental pieces of the federal government ought to be organized. They were kind of scattered around the federal government. There was some air pollution control in, such as it was in HEW, water pollution control in Department of Interior, and bits and pieces all around the government. Ultimately, out of that process, the president in July of 1970 sent a reorganization plan to Congress, indicating that he planned to gather the pieces of 5 agencies and 5 departments and 15 agencies together in a new organization called the Environmental Protection Agency, was not going to be a cabinet department, was not going to have developmental responsibilities. Its job was to focus on the environment. And then out of that, the plan set before Congress for 60 days. They didn't pass resolutions objecting to it, so it came into effect 60 days after that, December 2nd, 1970, EPA came into existence. And I don't know whether you want me to indicate how that first administrator came about or not. But,
Sure, just
okay.
tell us how Ruckelshaus became
Well, the first administrator, Bill Ruckelshaus, the person that I came from the Department of Justice with, had a slender background in the environment to the extent that he had, well in the state Attorney General's office in Indiana, had done some work with the Stream Pollution Control Board. In any event, in July of 1970, there was a piece in the Periscope column of Newsweek indicating that the president was thinking about 3 people for the administrator of EPA. One of them was Bill Ruckelshaus. Ruckelshaus at that point was kind of embarrassed seeing that, went up to see John Mitchell, the Attorney General, and said that I'm not looking to get out of my job as Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division. Later that fall, I had been put in charge of a effort to take people from the Department of Justice around to the nation's campuses and try to convince the students that the Department of Justice was not repression central. And part of that, I took my dean, or former dean, Erwin Griswold, and the Public Affairs Director for the Department of Justice to Minnesota. On the way back on the airplane, I mentioned to Jack Hushin, the PR man, that I thought we were kind of sitting around waiting to see if Ruckelshaus was going to be appointed head of EPA, because we'd heard nothing and we knew that time frame was approaching. Mitchell said, well, I'm going to see Dick over the weekend. I mentioned to Ruckelshaus. Ruckelshaus went up to see Mitchell. Mitchell said, I'm going to see Dick over the weekend. Mitchell came in the next Monday morning and said, the job is yours. So it shows that there's kind of just how serendipity things can come about.
So the EPA starts with a Republican president,
Right.
Nixon, and then, Bill, you served a Republican president, and I guess I don't know how to ask this in a less pointed way, but what's happened to the Republicans?
Well, that's a question. Let me just first add a little bit to what Jim just said, because I was also in the White House in 1970.
In the Council on Environmental Quality.
Yes, Council on Environmental Quality. It was a brand new institution created by National Environmental Policy Act, and was sitting in my office one day when I was handed, I used to go around, I wrote the regulations with Timothy Atkinson, they were then called guidelines for environmental impact assessment, and would make the rounds of the agencies, and we were lucky if anybody of significance or consequence showed up to get these briefings. All of a sudden, I was delivered one afternoon a one-page piece of paper, and it enjoined construction of the permit for the right-of-way for the Alaska pipeline. This was really astonishing. It was by Judge Burns, Federal District Court in Washington, and the first clause was typed. A failure to comply with the Right-of-Way Act of, I think, the Mining and Mineral Leasing Law. Written as number 2 in his own hand, failure to comply with Section 1022C of the National Environmental Policy Act, Environmental Impact Statement. Well, the next day, my boss and I were at the Agriculture Department, and everybody but the secretary showed up for our briefing. This was a big deal. Something of that consequence could be stopped by a little-known law that nobody paid that much attention to. The extraordinary thing about this is that the legislative sponsors in the Senate, Muskie and Jackson, denied that they had ever had any expectation that the law could be used to stop major infrastructure. And they each, having claimed a responsibility for that section up until that moment, disavowed it. Extraordinary to me as a lawyer in the 20th century that they wouldn't have appreciated the litigation possibilities under that statute. But they didn't at all. I was just going to say, apropos of Nixon, I've been writing myself about this history a little bit, and I learned that Nixon saw that the environment was number 3 in the polls, late 68, early 69. And he said to his folks, it was after the war and the economy, get out front on the environment. It is thought that the possibility or likelihood in his mind that Muskie would be running against him in 72 might have impacted on this. Irrespective, what I learned is that the environmental priority did not begin, as I had always believed, with Ruckelshaus and my boss, Russell Train, who was a second administrator and was chairman of the council when I worked. Bud Krogh, John Whitaker, John Ehrlichman were already there, doing pretty impressive things by the time that those two were brought in. As far as what's happened to the Republican Party, I think it's very difficult. I remember Jack Kemp said to me once in our administration, he said, you and I run the most difficult departments from the point of view of the Republican Party. He said, we've not got a constituency in the people who matter in the Congress, and one has to have a president in the Republican Party to do something on the environment or on housing and urban development. And if that is so, a lot of people in the Congress will defer and will assume the president's priority should be acknowledged, but not with any enthusiasm. And this was constantly brought home to me. I remember testifying in favor of the Clean Air Act amendments, and Henry Waxman was beating up on us for various elements in it, even though he knew it was a very strong bill that we'd proposed, and later gave credit to the two Georges, George Bush and George Mitchell, for that achievement, the legislative amendments to 91. But the party isn't there, really, and I wasn't there then, honestly, even though I think the vote was 89-11 in the Senate in favor of it and something like 411-20 in the House. Everybody came around. But I remember the Republicans whom I looked to on the committee that I was testifying in front of to give me a little help and encouragement as I testified on that proposal were useless because they didn't understand the Clean Air Act. They had not been given an important role in defending it. They had not been in the majority, of course. And the party has to be directed. It's just, particularly if you're a regulator, I think there's a kind of reflexive suspicion. In this administration, obviously, it's particularly difficult. And the champions that we look to, if you look at the budget that just came out of the House, 27% reduction in air, water, and safe drinking water, and also enforcement. And also a provision that would deny any payments to lawyers who try to enforce laws from the public perspective. It's as though they're not going to enforce, and they won't allow anyone else to. I think that is really pernicious. One thing that I would like to remind a lot of them of is that my understanding from R.J. Miller, former president of Ford Motor and former dean of business at Stanford, is that he was offered by Roy Ash, the chairman of the commission, he was offered EPA. And he reports having said, well, you can't have the head of an oil company, of an auto company, take charge of the environment of the United States. Nice he saw that. You know, it doesn't sound like it required a great bolt of wisdom to come to that conclusion. And I'd like that story to be better known in Washington at this time. Thank you.
We'll come back to some of those things, but Gina, that's a nice segue to a question I think a lot of people would like the answer to, which is, how was it for you taking this leadership role on climate change at such an important time, and how is it now dealing with the fact that Scott Pruitt has taken the helm of the agency?
It was fun, and now it stinks. No, I'm just kidding. I thought I'd catch up on time for questions. Well, obviously it was a terrific opportunity for me because I had done an awful lot of work in the environment. And as Jody will attest, I think there was a lot of effort to get Congress to take action on climate change as the sort of best approach that we could get, but it was clear that that wasn't going to happen. And so it's something that we sort of anticipated in the first term, and frankly, I had been doing a lot of work at the state level to try to prepare for federal action and to get the country moving a little bit and helping with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and other things. So I was pretty excited about the opportunity, and I thought there were things that we could do. And clearly, I had the shortest conversation with the president when he asked if I wanted the EPA position. I told him only if I could do climate change, and he said, I only want you if you do climate change. So it was a very short conversation. We had many more after that about how to do it. But I can remember sitting in my, at EPA, not in the office I now hold, but in my old one at the Air Office, and listening to him, outline the climate action plan. And really, I think if you know the president, you would know that it was an incredibly thoughtful strategy to get the United States taking strong domestic action for the purpose of allowing him to use the leverage he had at that point to get an international agreement on Paris. I mean, it was all carefully orchestrated and all done to engage the entire cabinet, not just EPA, in that effort. So you had the Joint Chiefs of Staff talking about your national security interests, and you had your energy secretary speaking, and you had Jack Lew talking about economic impacts, so that it didn't lay just on the pretty skinny shoulders and weak shoulders of EPA, politically speaking. So I think it was I thought it was a great opportunity, and I think we took advantage of it as best we could, and I think it made a difference. I think it's in the, if you look at it in the markets that we're seeing on the energy side, I think the investments that the president made in renewable energy with ARA money made a big difference. I think there was a lot of opportunity for EPA to speak to the intersect between climate and public health, which I think if you look at the history in China, that's one of the reasons they're as aggressive on climate as they are, and we need a lesson learned on that. And I think we did great. And obviously it's disturbing to me to see the rollbacks of a lot of that work. But I feel pretty confident that we did the best job we could, and we really did pay attention to the science and the law. And I'm gonna, and I think it's going to be a lot longer and a lot smarter people that will have to figure out how to take that down. And I take great comfort in the fact that even though they're rethinking big things like the Clean Power Plan and all of the work on that we did on cars and vehicles, I take great comfort in the fact that clean energy is going, it's in the market, and they're trying extraordinary efforts to support coal and nuclear at this point, when everybody knows that once you're in the market, you just kind of move. And so I'm excited about that. And I'm also excited about what's happening in around the world about looking at the need to, at some point in time, get rid of internal combustion engines, the fact that GM tried to convince China otherwise and then came back and sort of gave up that strategy. So that's changing too. So the world has changed, whether, and I think it's going to continue. So the rollbacks are a problem. I will tell you the thing that I lose sleep over at night are two things. One, Bill mentioned, is whether or not EPA is going to be strong, and I think one of the foundations of EPA is its science. And it really disturbs me that Congress is actually legislating science now. In between what EPA is doing to try to dismantle its science structure and the way in which we do science, which everybody in the world does, the peer review process, and the way that Congress is marrying that with decisions that are simply against scientific credibility. That is what I lose sleep over all the time, not the rollbacks, but whether or not we're going to be able to regroup and stay strong.
So on that point, it's a perfect opportunity to ask Richard to play a little bit of a historian role about the EPA surviving times of trouble and coming back. And I wonder if you could reflect a bit on, say, the Reagan administration versus now.
Yeah, I want to go a few prefatory comments. First of all, I am very proud of my Midwestern accent, but whenever I hear Gina McCarthy, I wish I had that Boston accent. You know.
You're in Boston. We don't have an accent. You.
Hey, I'm going to stick up for an Illinois accent.
Yeah. Central Illinois accent.
Right.
Anyway, one quick historical footnote. Actually, one of the other three people being considered to be head of EPA in 1970, when Rocco Salas got it, was a person who had just lost a race in Congress for Texas in November 1970, a few weeks before, George H.W. Bush was also on the short list.
I didn't know that.
And the reason he didn't get it was because he had been worked with oil companies, and they thought that wouldn't look good. In terms of Republican, one thing I would say, Republican Party shift, if I can comment on that before I get to the EPA question, and that is, and this is not a defense of the Republican Party shift, but there's something to this, and that is that through several experiences, they learned they got no political return for it. I mean, Nixon was a very strong environmentalist for about 18 months. He did it in anticipation of running against Ed Muskie, and then after the November 1970 elections, when he realized that he had got nothing for it. If you read the Nixon papers, they're quite explicit where he says, basically, we're catering to the left too much on this. It's not a good political issue for us. We need to basically pay more attention to economics without getting caught. We have to re-examine our commitment to this. It's quite clear he's a politician, and he realized, he said, this isn't working for us. It's an issue based on responsibility. It's not a good political issue. We need to be on the side of against big government. And so he pretty much pivoted away and laid out ahead of time what Ronald Reagan ran on in 1980, against government and against responsibility, which was Jimmy Carter. And the same thing happened really to some extent to George H.W. Bush, who Bill worked for. He appointed as head of EPA Bill Reilly, like the most decorated environmentalists really ever put on head of that. It was an extraordinary appointment, and they did a huge amount. The Clean Air Act of 1990, they championed. Bush ran, said, I will be the environmental president. He ran against Michael Dukakis on that issue, using Boston Harbor as an example, and he did a lot for those first 2 years. And then he discovered in November 1990 that he got no credit for it. And at that point, his constituency, the business constituency, basically was complaining more and more, and then the Quail Competitiveness Council comes into play, and he pivots his last 2 years, as you remember in Rio at the end. You go to George W. Bush in 2000. He campaigns to say he's going to regulate carbon dioxide. He makes a campaign pledge in October 2000 to try to outflank Gore on the environment. He appoints the head of EPA, Christine Todd Whitman, an extraordinary politician, a national figure, very pro-environment, very pro-climate change. And then Dick Cheney really does a job on Whitman and changes the direction at that point, and it's never stopped. If I had to look for a moment in history, it would be the contract with America, Newt Gingrich, in 1994. That was the real pivot point of the Republican Party, and the two parties have really been polarized ever since then. That's why we've had no major environmental legislation since 1990. Congress is paralyzed. On EPA at risk, we've played this several times in the past. What Ronald Reagan, when they interviewed Ann Gorsuch, then Ann Gorsuch, to head EPA, they asked her whether she was willing to bring EPA to its knees. That was she asked her in the interview period. The idea was to cut EPA really out, to eliminate their budget. Contract with America, looks like what's happening now is to cut EPA's budget by 30%. It looked over and over again like this was going to happen. It didn't happen during Reagan. It didn't happen in Reagan because Congress fought back. A lot of Republicans in Congress fought back. Senator Stafford, Senator Jeffords, Senator Chafee, Howard Baker was a really wonderful Republican in Congress. They fought back during the Reagan era, and during Reagan never vetoed a bill. He signed a whole bunch of bills. During Bush as well, people thought for a while, but in fact, they didn't end up doing very much transformative. George Bush, when he won in 2001 with Cheney, it looked like, all right, now it's really going to happen. There's this great transformation. Actually, the architecture pretty much stayed in place during those years. It wasn't like it was going to be under Obama, but they basically embraced the architecture. They want cost benefit more than others, but it's debates at the margin. It's not uprooting the whole institution. And some of the rulemaking was really inspired. The cross-state interstate rule was an inspired rule. They had some good stuff. It was more industry sensitive than others and more cost sensitive, but it wasn't radical in any way. But now it's different. I've studied a lot of this, and every time some other part of the branch of government has always checked the other one way or the other. At this point, it doesn't seem to be happening. We've got a judicial branch, which we'll see what they do, but it's not the 1970s in terms of the role of the judiciary. They're a more passive group. In the last 25 years or so, they play a more passive role in terms of reviewing agency actions. We'll see whether that changes with the new administration. But you've got Congress and the President basically aligned on a lot of these issues. We've never had that happen before. It's not happened since 1970 that we've had both branches aligned, and we have, the appointments being made. It's a very radical group being appointed, especially to EPA in particular.
I don't want us to go down into depression now. It's too early. So I'm gonna. Oh yes.
I was just going to add, that is a splendid explanation of the evolution of and it's totally consistent with a number of experiences I had. I received a call from the White House, and I'm trying to remember what year it was, and I was told, do not tell your boss that you received this call, but we want you to write a speech disavowing the environment. It will be delivered at the Detroit Economic Club. And I went downstairs and I told my boss. And I said, I'm not going to write that speech. And I remember thinking, there are levels of sophistication that really far exceed my own when he said, Bill, somebody's looking out for us. They could have gone anywhere for this speech. They're looking to you to make this the least offensive could possibly be. Oh, okay. I wrote the speech. And it was a very tepid thing about how you integrate economic aspirations with environmental goals and things like that. And Nixon delivered about 3 sentences from it, as I recall. But still, and I remember my own boss, Russell Train. I only learned this a few years ago from him. When he presented the environmental program for '71 to the president, he picked out the National Land Use Policy Act, which had been my responsibility, and he said, "Who's the son of a bitch who wrote this?" And I always thought it very kind of my boss not to tell me what the president thought of my work, but he didn't. And yet, he proposed it.
Right.
It's really, and Ruckelshaus is quite hard on Nixon. And I've always thought if you credit the president for what he did as opposed to what he really thought and what he said, you gotta say that he was there when it mattered, and that was the founding of some of the architecture of environmental protection for the whole country.
Could I say something hopeful? After listening to Richard, now I realize that every Republican administration changes position in midstream, so it could look really good for us in a year from now.
That is terrific. Bravo.
I'm done.
Bill's comments after Rich's comments put me in mind of something I've been wanting to ask all of you, which is about moments for real creativity. But Bill, you said that moment of writing the speech is a moment of creativity. How do I make this softer and less bad than it could be? And I know, for example, Jim, in the first few years of Ruckelshaus, you had to be very creative trying to enforce water pollution when you didn't have the Water Pollution Act in place.
We had the Refuse Act of 1899 passed under the great.
Say something about one of those moments where you did something kind of creative and unanticipated that you couldn't have known you would wind up doing.
Well, I was thinking before coming here that I generally followed the advice of my general counsel at EPA, who was Don Elliott for the first couple of years, professor of administrative law at Yale. At the other school, yes. And then Ray Ludwishevsky. And was told by my general counsel that I had to agree to permit manganese to be added to the gasoline supply. And and I decided that if I lost this, I would, I'd be comforted by, I think it was Justice Harlan who said, sometimes you make a decision that you fully expect to be reversed, but it won't be on your conscience. Something of that sort. Richard probably knows the remark. And so I did not allow it. And Senator Warner came in to accompany the CEO and the general counsel who complained about where they knew I was going. And I was expecting a barrage, and after I finished explaining that last time we allowed a metal to be introduced into the gasoline supply, it was lead, and it took us 25 years to get it out. So we didn't allow it, but it was, I think, the largest employer in Virginia, the company that was sponsoring it, and a major contributor to Senator Warner. Senator Warner heard, this is not the current Senator Warner, this is John Warner. He heard me out, and he turned to the CEO and said he was very disappointed in our outlook, my outlook, but he'd never known me to do anything other than to call it honestly and conscientiously, and therefore he was going to support me. Whereupon I thought they were going to strangle him. They couldn't believe this avowal. But I ended up feeling very good about it. It never happened, finally. And as I think about other things, there was a lot of need to be creative in the second 2 years of the Bush administration when Vice President Quayle headed the Competitiveness Council. Pat Buchanan attacked the president from the right. You may remember he proposed getting rid of EPA. And the Wall Street Journal was on my case for the Clean Air Act and all of the regulations that were coming out pursuant to it, filling the Federal Register along with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but somehow that was immune to attack of the sort we were getting. And things really changed. And to try to defend no net loss of wetlands, which was the policy of the Bush administration then, a delineation manual and things of that sort, involved my doing things that I was actually ordered not to do by the Chief of Staff. So we had a lot of contentious relations in the second 2 years. But the truth was that most of the people around George H.W. Bush never understood his commitment to be the environmental president. That's the Chief of Staff, the Vice President, the Budget Director, and considered it was merely a ploy to help get elected. And once he was elected, that he wouldn't move on it. But also, I fault the environmental community on this because they gave him very little credit for the Clean Air Act. They really did. And more than once, he reminded me of that you'll never have the environmentalists with you. And the unfortunate thing was that his son, inspired a lot by Karl Rove, learned from that. And Karl Rove has said to me, your guys never support us. They just won't. And I would have to say that's probably true. And if you're in a situation as I was in, and you cannot promise that the president who supports the environment will get credit for it politically, it's a tough place to be. He has to really believe in what he's doing at that point. And he is also obviously very distracted. The Kuwait War, the reunification of Germany, there's a lot on the president's plate. So those are realities. And I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned, too, is that the avatars of the environment in that era were Northeasterners and Far Westerners. And when the party shifted to the Southeast, Southwest, you just didn't get it. You got people, and I'm reminded of this today, I'm on a board of a biofuels company, and when there are hearings on their location of a new pellet plant, which is just using the residual forest products of small forest lot owners, the antipathy to the environmentalists is really visceral. It's very, very strong throughout the Carolinas, Mississippi, Louisiana. And it bothers me a lot as somebody who comes out of that movement and is really still in it as Chairman Emeritus of World Wildlife Fund. It's something the community needs to pay attention to and to find a way back into the good graces of a lot of pretty well-meaning people who, not parenthetically, voted for Trump.
Jim, can I invite you to talk about how you used enforcement and the Refuse Act and did something very creative on water?
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a loss there. The early refuse, the early water pollution cases filed by EPA The first one was an announcement Ruckelshaus made less than a month after he came into office that he was going to take on and sue 3 cities, Atlanta, Detroit, and Cleveland, over the discharges from their publicly owned treatment plants. But so that was a kind of a shock to the system, but actually the authority that lay behind it was simply something in the old Federal Water Pollution Control Act that allowed to hold conferences where there was interstate pollution and to try to work those issues out. So that, and then the next series of cases that were announced by the Department of Justice were against some steel companies that were in West Virginia and Ohio, and for violating the Refuse Act. And again, it was at that point in time, the law said you can't discharge refuse into a navigable water of the United States unless you have a permit from the Corps of Engineers. At that point, the Corps didn't even have any permit program. So, but we kind of landed a blow to the jaw of the steel and companies that were involved there, by way of sending a message that there's a new sheriff in town. He's going to proverbially take names and kick ass. And Ruckelshaus had a very challenging job coming into this agency that was made up of bits and pieces of agencies. They were located all over Washington. They were located all over the country, not co-located. They weren't under common managers. How do you get an agency up and running and at the same time try to meet the public's expectation that now there's a new agency that's supposed to be protecting us? So it was kind of a combination of taking some very visible steps that captured the public attention while you were trying to put this agency together. I mean, he compared it to trying to perform an appendectomy on yourself while running a 100-yard dash, which about, I think...
Very picturesque.
What's that?
It's very picturesque.
It was certainly picturesque. I mean, when you mentioned about creativity, I'm not sure this was creativity of solving a problem, but certainly one of the challenges Ruckelshaus came in as the first administrator in dealing with Nixon, who was largely a reclusive figure and did not have much contact with Ruckelshaus other than when he swore him in as administrator. And Ruckelshaus had 2 very major decisions in really the second year of his administration. One was to grant whether or not to grant the automobile industry an additional 1 year to try to meet the very demanding standards that Congress had set out in the Clean Air Act of 1970, that they had to reduce their emissions of hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide by 90% for their 1975 models. But they would be able to get a 1-year extension. And in that decision, Ruckelshaus made the judgment that he was going to decide that issue and then go over and tell the White House what he was going to do, but he was not going to go over and ask them what they thought he ought to do about it. He was not looking for any advice, and actually in that particular case, it also used John Mitchell, who would not be somebody that came to mind as thinking of a very pro-environment, but that he ran some interference on. The other issue that Ruckelshaus had along that line was banning of DDT or essentially all the uses of DDT, which he did in June of 1972. And you had the then chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, Jamie Whitten, was a very fervent believer in use of pesticides and so on. And Ruckelshaus made that decision, and again, the same way, basically, that case made the decision and then got on the plane for Stockholm, and where we were for the first UN conference on the human environment.
Gina, I have my personal favorites on creativity in the last administration that you were responsible for, but is there a moment of something you're especially excited about having done that was perhaps not foreseeable?
that's a real, I felt like I was tap dancing every day for like 8 years. Seriously, I mean, what comes to mind are a couple of things, and I mean, there are so many areas in which we had to think a little bit outside the box, but our challenge was to try to get things done, but in a fairly moderate way. There were so many things to do. If you look at it, when we walked in, we had really the prior administration didn't do too much, and we had our back against the wall to deal with mandatory duties here, which are like what they're called. You have to do them, right? And so we ended up with, remember the train wreck slide we had to walk through? I mean, everything that had been denied that you needed to do with utilities was laying on us. And the creativity was getting through that, was lining it up to say, what do you do first that's going to benefit the second? And it was actually quite an elegant strategy, because by the time we got to the Clean Power Plan, we had already done so much that the Clean Power Plan was clearly not as big a lift as it would have been had we started there. You had the mercury and air toxic standard, the cross-state air pollution rule. You had the effluent limitation guidelines, the coal ash rule. I mean, you just go on and on and on. And each one was done with an understanding of what the impact would be, not just on the energy world, but on public health, in a way that we established incredibly good working relationships, not just with the utilities to understand what they needed to do, because I consider energy to be an environmental issue. It is a big deal. It is a common need. You have to have it. And so working with them, but also the RTOs and others were incredibly engaged in how you take this step. So it all worked together. And I thought that was for me, it was a really proud opportunity to go from the air program where you set those up to actually then adding, climate requirements, which I thought were pretty reasonable. But I know, one of your favorites has to be the car stuff, because you did it. And it was very clever. But honestly, I think you know as well as I do that EPA has the most clever individuals working in that agency. I have never seen anything like it. So, people might credit me with the idea. The only thing I did was listen really well, and then tried to translate it into English, which is helpful. But the idea that you would actually ask the car industry to look at their fleet and allow the fact that everybody needs to have different kinds of cars, and you wouldn't look at what you need to do to get to all electric vehicles, but you reasonably looked at what each would do, was a brilliant way to look at that issue. And without that, we would have been dead.
You remind me that I had a principle. We had a very strong enforcement record, more penalties assessed and settlements and criminal convictions than in the previous 18-year history of the agency. But I tried never to antagonize the oil and the auto industry in the same week. But
I had no such constraints.
But the point I wanted to make is, at one point in the cabinet, the energy secretary pointed at me, and he said, "He's in my knickers." This was James Watkins, Admiral Watkins. And then he pointed to the transportation secretary, and he's in yours. And he pointed to the Interior Secretary. And that was extraordinary. That's the kind of agency EPA is. Yeah. And that's when you realize that you've got to have a president who knows that, and most of whose mail is probably not positive to you, because the people who have big stakes in your decisions that actually cost them something inundate the White House. And as Quayle said once to me about my wetlands priority, he said, you got to understand that this is hitting the base. I mean, we're talking about farmers and realtors and landowners, property owners, and all over the country. And I remember thinking, well, hell, I guess I could just give it up. I mean, it is the law, as we at least saw it. But the president has to be there for you. And I've often thought, with Cheney having the veto authority that he had, it had to be really very, very difficult to be in the George W. Bush administration. I did think that if it came to it, when I appealed to something to the president, I remember once I came back from a meeting with Mrs. Thatcher in a conference she had on upper atmospheric ozone, And we got an agreement with the developing countries. India was a real holdout. For $500 million that would go into this fund to help them get out of CFCs, they would support the Montreal Protocol. And CFCs were being manufactured all over the developing world then. And our chief of staff got together with the Treasury Secretary and the OMB director, and we had a meeting with them, and they said, no way. And I said, you don't do it. The Montreal Protocol won't work. Developing countries won't play. And I remember Darman said, well, your guys, the environmentalists, taught us how to do it. Just head them off at the World Bank. And the chief of staff said, yeah, we don't bring the ball, there's no game. And I walked out of the meeting, I thought, that's pretty heavy opposition. Then I remembered Mrs. Thatcher. I called up Mrs. Thatcher, and the decision was made by President Bush the next day. I don't think they ever knew how that happened, but that's how it happened. She weighed in with the president, and he saw what she was saying, and it worked. But it's got to be extremely difficult in this administration to run an EPA along the style that Gina McCarthy did. But of course, we don't even have that. We don't have the EPA standing up the extraordinary position that it was I learned this the other day from Elon Strait, who was a carryover for about 8 weeks in this administration. The only person in the White House, or at least at his level, who came on very strongly on the position of staying in Paris was the EPA administrator, and he was against.
Speaking of that, I wanted to ask Richard, at the tail end of this next question, I'm going to ask Richard to say something about the Supreme Court and environmental issues, but before I ask you to do that, I want to ask you guys, in your time serving at EPA, did you think about law as a constraint? In other words, did you think about strategies you couldn't adopt because there were legal obstacles and you'd run into trouble in the courts? Did you think that way about it, or did you think, we're going to take a risk with this and we'll just see how the courts treat us?
Can I jump on that a little bit? You know, the first thing I thought about was, what's the mission of the agency?
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's what is being forgotten now. It's all about cost and what do we roll back. I thought about what the biggest public health challenges were that we're facing, and what authority has the agency been given? How do I work within that authority? And I use science to both tell me what the biggest problems were, as well as the benefits of moving in particular directions. If you just do your job, it's not rocket science. I think the challenge is you have there's a lot of challenges. I mean, let's face it. But one of the biggest challenges is that these guys were really successful, especially Ruckelshaus and the early crew, because now to convince somebody that environmental pollution is a problem for you, you have to bring scientists to the table to explain emerging contaminants. It's not polluted air and water that you can see and rivers burning. And it makes it hugely challenging, which is why this administration going after science is a very good strategy, because that's all we can rely on now to explain what are the challenges today that you need to keep investing in. But the law was, you people drove me crazy, all you lawyers. Of course it was in the front of my head. We had to measure the imbalance. How do I get the best benefit with what is it going to economically cost, with what is it going to be risky or not risky legally? Because it would have been crazy not to have thought about that, because I've been doing this work for so long that the last thing I want to do is to just be a grandstanding and say, look at how great I did, and have it go down in flames. That to me is the worst thing. It needs to be implemented. That's the success, not doing it.
I did consider it a constraint. I remember driving the Superfund settlements much harder than I actually believed was in the long-term interest, because I was hoping we'd get the statute changed. And it was changed. Brownfields succeeded where we had proposed that, but it hadn't gone anywhere with the Republican administration. But one of the things that I thought was underutilized when I got to EPA was the sense in the country that EPA is the environmental conscience, and we ought to do more than regulate. And so the voluntary programs, Energy Star and 3350 and green lights, and a whole series of a suite of pesticides approvals on a fast track for chemicals that weren't persistent and weren't toxic and weren't carcinogen in any amount, things like that, which inexplicably, the administration now is getting rid of. I mean, these are fully voluntary. Corporations tend to really like them. At least the progressive chemical companies really like them because they had the new chemicals, some that didn't, opposed to some of them. But Energy Star has saved thousands of pounds of CO2, and you cannot get a significant building loan in the state of California, and I suppose it's true elsewhere, if your building is not going to be Energy Star. What's not to like? And Mayor Bloomberg is alleged to have said that if they get rid of it, costs $57 million a year, he will pick it up, and that'd be great if he did, but why should he have to?
Richard, can I ask you just a general question about how environmental issues and natural resource issues have fared in the Supreme Court over time? I remember there was a particularly bad year, I think the year of Entergy maybe, where we lost all.
Well, I lost that one.
No, not yet.
I figure she brings that up.
Aside from Entergy, got 5 losses, I think, and was it 2008 or 2009?
Yeah.
And so, things wax and wane, but can you give us a
Yeah, I mean, I think the Supreme Court has sort of had an uneasy, sort of and somewhat skewed relationship with environmental law since 1970. There's never been a justice, liberal or conservative, except maybe more conservative than liberal. Certainly none that's been an environmental justice that's had that as sort of a priority concern. You can take the most liberal justice had things that they really cared about. No one was really caring about the environment. That was not why they're there. It was not part of their agenda at all on the court. And more the ones who paid attention to environmental issues on the court tend to be more the conservative justices, and they saw it more as an irritant. I mean, they saw environmental law as destabilizing. The fact is, environmental law was this unbelievable transformation in the 1970s. I mean, I think a very successful one, but it really went through, and all these new laws were passed. It tried to redefine the relationship of no less than humankind to the environment, the way business was doing business, and that destabilized a lot of interest. It destabilized a lot of expectations around the country, and it tended to sort of infiltrate other areas of law, whether it was administrative law or bankruptcy law or criminal law or corporate law. It was a very destabilizing influence, and I think a lot of the justices didn't understand that's part of a positive transformation of law, that you have sort of new laws come in, new equilibrium have to be struck over time, and it works out. It's sort of a wrestling match through legal evolution, and a new thing was coming in pretty quickly that was trying to restrike equilibrium. And a lot of them saw that sort of interference and that destabilization as something that was negative, I think, instead of something that was positive, something that they needed to sort of clamp down on instead of something to sort of allow happen over time. And certainly Justice Scalia, among others, had that reaction. And so what you tend to see the court do as a result is almost only took cases where industry sought review. They never took cases where the environmental groups alone sought review. They might take cases where EPA, the government, would seek review, but they granted review in Sierra Club v. Morton in like 1970 or 71. And the next time they granted review at the exclusive request of an environmental group wasn't until the 2000s. So the court was sort of ready to correct mistakes of one kind done by the lower court, but they weren't ready to believe mistakes were being done by the other side. So environmentalists won. The ears were up a little bit that maybe there might be a problem here. If the environmentalists lost, though, when they saw Supreme Court review, unless it happened that the federal government was on their side, the court never took review for decades and decades. And you know the mistakes were being made both ways in the lower courts. Once they granted review in a case, the court was pretty balanced. The environmentalists won some, the environmentalists lost some. You can look through the record. They won some big ones. They lost some big ones. But generally, when the court had the case on the merits, they were pretty balanced and fair. You can see some good wins either way. It's when they take cases. It's so important. It's at the cert stage. They only take about 70 cases these days out of 9,000 that are granted. And so they only granted cases of one kind more than the other. And that leads to a real skewing from the court's results. On the merits, the justices They're sometimes more conservative than I would like, but they do a pretty good job. They're good lawyers. You win the EME Homer case. That's the transport. That's a big win. You win Whitman v. American Trucking. They took it thinking it was wrong. They look at it and they go, well, actually, 9-0. Actually, environmentalists are right. So on the merits, they're a pretty fair group, even if they're more conservative than I might like. It's at the cert stage we have a lot of skewing.
They took two takings cases that I organized a coalition to try to defend, and the only reason to take it was to reverse,
Right.
essentially,
Right.
and to the disadvantage. But they came out okay.
Right.
It's exactly the
Well,
example
the case I
you
just
described.
argued. They took, of course, Murphy, Wisconsin, a case I argued for the court last March. They took it in reverse. But once they see it and you try to explain it, and they actually see how it works, and actually environmental regulation isn't just negative, it actually adds value to property, they figure it out, and they can go the way I think they should. But at the cert stage, they think this is a big problem.
Right.
They're more convinced one way than the other. And that leads to a skewing in what courts they're taking, because they're taking cases which are vehicles for reversal against the environment, and maybe you convince them they shouldn't reverse. They're not taking the cases where the facts are really good to prove the environmental points, unless you've got the federal government filing the cert petition.
People think biography is relevant to Supreme Court justices' positions on these things. So people think of Sandra Day O'Connor and the Lazy Bee Ranch. People think about the fact that Neil Gorsuch is an angler and a skier, and they invest a lot in the personal biographies of the justices, but it turns out not to be, or does it turn out?
Oh, no, it's still true on the merits. Absolutely, you can still play it out. I mean, the reason Justice Kennedy has actually been, I mean, he's a decisive vote, but the reason he's much more sensitive about protection of ecologically sensitive properties and the rest, he's from California. I mean, you can be in some parts and think land is static. If you're from California, you understand how fragile the coastline can be, and you can see that in his opinions. Sandra Day O'Connor was pretty good on endangered species and wildlife, critters, because she understood that from growing up on a ranch. I think those things make a difference.
But the 60s and 70s, the lower court judges struck me as very environmental. Is that not your?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
impression?
that's the 60s and 70s. There was a moment in environmental law, and Scully Wright epitomizes it, where they equated the civil rights movement with the environmental movement. And so the same way that they were very proactive on civil rights issues because they viewed the courts needed to step in, the same judges, Scully Wright was the same judge who did civil rights. Then he sees environment in the same terms, and he talked about the unrepresented future generations and the need to make sure they find representation. Our duty in the courts, our judicial duty is to ensure, right, that these important federal interests are not lost in the vast hallways of the federal bureaucracy. That's Scully Wright, but he views it as a civil rights issue for future generations.
Can I say something seriously hopeful? I think that that's going to be what the generation today is most focused on. You know, when I go and give classes, there is a tremendous sensitivity to social justice. And if you look at the numbers in terms of the environment, I had a good friend who was the Minister of the Environment or the Secretary in Mexico, and he said, Gina, the biggest problem with the environment is poverty. And I actually totally agree with him. And I was just released a Lancet report with a bunch of people. It was funded to look at the international impacts of pollution. And they identified that 1 out of every 6 deaths are related to environmental exposures internationally. And that results in about 9 million deaths a year. And 92% of those are in low-income countries. So, I mean, and you can see it in the United States. We've done great, but just look around. You know who's been left behind. And I actually think that could end up being a significant factor in both looking and revisiting traditional pollutants, who's left behind, where money needs to be spent, and also addressing climate change, because we know who's going to get whacked. And when people see that, I think young people actually get this way better, certainly than my generation understood it. And I have great faith that they're going to be speaking up, even if we have a hiatus.
That was the reason for the environmental justice movement at EPA.
I have 2 more questions, and I will open it up to other folks. But this feels like over the last few decades, at least the last two, the cost-benefit analysis framework for understanding environmental regulation, natural resource management, has come to dominate. And so to justify any kind of regulation, we need to explain why there's a net benefit in traditional cost-benefit terms. And that's taken hold in the White House. It started, of course, way back, even with Jimmy Carter, and carries through today. And I wonder if something is lost in terms of the loss of the moral argument about why we ought to do things to protect the natural world, not just for ourselves. And have you grappled with that, and have you seen that evolve over time?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly to the extent that a lot of the cost-benefit analyses don't take into account things that you can't easily put a financial figure on or a price on, means that they get left out of that equation. I certainly found when I was particularly deputy administrator, and you're trying to make these decisions about where you set standards, you had the economists coming in and say, well, we've run this quadratic equation, and this is where it ought to be. And you take a step back and you say, but that doesn't account for some of these other effects and so on that people are going to feel. So I think you're exactly right on that point.
You know, I have had mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, I was part of the Vietnam generation and was in the Army then, did not go to Vietnam, but really distrusted a lot of cost benefit because it was so abused in that era maybe. But as an environmentalist, I was wary of making moral arguments because mostly environmental policy is a prudential business. It's, you hope to bring people along, you hope to convince the people who are not convinced with good science, good evidence. And if you paint too firm a moral case around yourself and exclude your critics or opponents, you're essentially saying they're immoral. And so from an environmental point of view, it's always struck me that's not a place you want to go early in the debate. However, as you get into the issues, some of the things that Gina was talking about, I remember once looking at the pollution that the pueblos in New Mexico were getting delivered from Albuquerque. It was a totally moral issue. And I remember I gave the Indians the sovereign power under the Clean Water Act, which I had the right to do, I had the power to do, determining that they had the right resources. I remember they had a Phi Beta Kappa lawyer with a ponytail, and he was with Paul Weiss or somewhere in New York, and I thought, I think they can handle it. And we took a lot of abuse for that from the Albuquerque newspaper, an editorial board meeting, and they said, these people are going to break us. They're going to cost us $3 billion. And I said, look, you've got yourselves, 2 senators and a congressman. All they've got is me, and they're not stupid. But you go see the water that you're delivering, untreated waste that they even had rituals in. And that had a lot to do with the establishment of the environmental justice movement from my point of view. Indians, the tribes, had a huge amount of land. I was surprised to become EPA administrator. I was from Illinois. I wasn't used to that. And then to see that they were accepting hazardous waste, which they would get paid to do, I thought they really do need a defender. And we became that for them. That's a moral issue. And there's no reason not to call it for what it is. It's a disproportionate amount of power that's being used against them and an exploitation of their interest, their weakness. Similar to for some of the minority interests elsewhere. We had a huge interest in the Texas border, and we were able to use NAFTA to get $100 million, counting the governor of Texas commitment too, to clean up colonias, which was the source of the largest problem of gastrointestinal illness in the country. And basically, lack of sanitation is what explained it. Those issues are definitely moral. It's harder to make a moral question out of an emission standard or an effluent standard, and it's really kind of an uphill battle unless you've got disease and things like that to counter. But Lord knows in the developing world, where, by the way, inversely to the distance that you get from Washington, EPA has a fabulous reputation in the developing world for the assistance and the standards and the epidemiology, the automobile laboratories, and the rest. And I think it's a role that really should be, has been from time to time emphasized, and major soft power for the United States, including in China.
Let me ask.
Could I just say one more thing? I don't at all disagree with Bill. I think he's right on. I do think climate change is a moral issue, and it's hard to avoid that. being, I think, that calling that out. But one of the things it did open up, and one of the things that bothers me so much, is I have people come up all the time saying, I believe in climate change. It's not a belief system. No, seriously, this is upsetting to me, because if you ever testified in front of House Science, Technology, and whatever the heck they're called, you know, you would see that they really are hanging on to a religious premise in terms of how they're looking at climate change. It is a slippery slope. You know, when you move away from science to start talking about morality, that quickly slides into religious beliefs. And you have a chair of the science committee that, you know, thinks that you know, the world was created a few thousand years ago. It's hard to testify in front of that committee, you know, and to think that we probably ought to just be sticking to the science as much as we can. And I find it very disturbing right now that seems to be bleeding into issues as dramatically as it is.
And yet Richard Cizik, who headed the political element for the Evangelical Association of America, once cautioned me that I should not use allusions to science. He said, my constituency hears that, and they think, oh, you're one of those Darwin guys. And he was a constructive figure. He really was. And I said, well, how should I talk about this? He said, talk about stewardship, care for creation, responsible behavior, and treating the natural systems and the rest. He said, there are ways to do it. And at any rate, that's not a great position to have to respect. But we used to do something similar with China. We couldn't talk about climate change. We had to talk about energy efficiency and things like that. And now the Chinese have changed their position, and maybe some others will in this country.
Before I let others have a say, I have one last question I feel compelled to ask on behalf of all of our students in the room, which is basically boils down to how do you become you? So some of them, undoubtedly want to be the EPA administrator or serve at the highest levels of government in some capacity. And I guess the question is, how did you get there? And did somebody open a door? Did you push through a door? What happened?
Well, in my case, it started coming to Harvard Law School.
Good answer.
Where in 1960s,
That was a setup.
In the 1960s, the only closest thing was Har's land use planning class, and then I went back to Indiana. I worked for somebody in a Senate race. He came to Washington, was asked by President Nixon to be the first head of EPA. He brought me along with him, and the rest of my life has been spent in the environment. So I guess, I don't know whether it's either good planning on going to Harvard Law School and then serendipity after that.
We once were at Camp David, and Barbara Bush said, I said to George the other day, these are all our old friends. He said, well, we've been here for 100 years. I mean, why wouldn't they? And then she said, except you. We didn't know you. And we were later in the Netherlands for something, and the Queen of the Netherlands, who was actually a friend of mine because her father was one of the founders of the World Wildlife Fund, asked, where'd you get him? And she said, well, the President said, George just said, for EPA, I don't want politics, I just want the best. So I really liked that. That was okay. But in fact, I think it was the Old Boy Network. Russell Train hosted Bill Ruckelshaus in the summer of 1988 down at Hobe Sound, Florida, and said to him, as he reported to me when he came back, that Ruckelshaus said, if this man gets elected president, he's going to likely turn to us for advice about who should run EPA, and I would suggest Reilly. Ruckelshaus said. Train came back and she said, well, that would be difficult for me. He was the chairman of a merged institution that I was still putting together, World Wildlife Fund and the Conservation Foundation. But then he said to me, so what would you do if that were offered? This was June of election year. I said, I'd say no. He said, why? I said, well, I think his record in the Reagan administration is not very encouraging. And I remember Train said, well, given your history and commitments, it'd be very hard for you to say no to a president. So you need to think about your successor here, if that were to happen. And I went home, I told my wife of this conversation. She said, you're going to EPA. Anyway, I did. Right.
I have really absolutely no idea how I ended up because I speak so plainly and always have. So it's not the best thing I'd advise everybody if they want to move up in the political arena. But having said that, I think, what I try to tell students now is that they should really not just focus on a particular pathway. It's about doing something you're passionate about, but also about being open to all kinds of opportunities that arise. And what I always tried to do is take a job that was really interesting, that I had absolutely no idea whether I could do it. You have to take risks. And I took all kinds of jobs. I had no idea what they did. And you surround yourself by really smart people, and they think you're brilliant, and you succeed. It works for me, and I keep doing it.
I'd like to second that, really, that I certainly got into government service with an idea of the JFK notion that government is a high calling. And so you kind of prepare and think about that, and then you just follow what opportunities come. Get yourself prepared with knowledge and tool skills, and then as you work in different positions, you'll find that may lead to others. And
I'd like to ask you and Richard a question, could I? When Jim and I got out of school, public service was the highest thing you could do.
Yep.
It may be that I spent some time in private equity, but that is not true among some of the best and the brightest. I also taught at the Stanford Business School for a year, and they're fabulously qualified students, but zero interest, most of them, in going into public life, public service. I'd like to ask you, this generation that you teach, so many want to go into finance, I know, from the colleges. Am I wrong that that public interest fascination standard ideal has waned?
I'm not officially on this panel, so.
I would say you're incorrect.
Incorrect.
Certainly here in law school, I would never speak for across the river at HBS, but here, no, I think there's tremendous interest in the students. I mean, that includes a lot of students, it's what they prefer to do right after law school, if the positions were there. A lot of the ones who actually will go to private law firms, even there for a few years to pay off their debts. There's tremendous interest in public service and in public interest work at our community. I think one of the more challenging issues they face today, which I have my own personal view on, is whether they would go into public service in this administration.
Yeah.
I think I would encourage them to do so. But that's a personal decision. But
I should say to this audience that Richard Lazarus put together the best quality team I have seen since the Nixon Council on Environmental Quality, which was really top line for the Oil Spill Commission. Richard put them together, and they were really fabulous. Harvard Law School, you may not be surprised, was well represented among them, but young, energetic, idealistic, and extremely talented. So I didn't know whether that was, yeah.
I would actually say that there's tremendous interest in doing something in public service now, because they know that they can go and do different things with different parts of their careers, and they're not necessarily locked into doing one thing forever. So I encourage them, and I feel like all the students are open to this, that there's nothing wrong with going to the private sector, there's nothing wrong with making a bunch of money, there's nothing wrong with doing various things in your career that are not about the government, but spend some time, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level, in the government. And the challenge I put to them is, if not you, who? You know, like, it's sort of, who do you think
It might
should
be those people
running?
down the road that Richard was not wanting to refer to by name.
And I think Richard and I agree on this idea that you should not be somehow so ideologically committed you think you shouldn't go into an administration you don't happen to agree with, because you get tremendous experience as a young person, and you're not important enough to take responsibility for anything you do.
don't take responsibility at the top these days.
well, Jody, just one thing. I mean, they're called career employees for a reason. And you don't want to acquiesce in career people being basically political people. And the people that Gina worked with at EPA, and you work with EPA, and Jim, they've been there for decades, and they're fabulous.
And a lot of them stayed through the Gorsuch years.
Right, they're fabulous, and they did extraordinary work.
Let me take one or